Okay, today I'm talking to you about this. I'm going to start by calling it a particle, but that's, as we'll see, is possibly problematic. But I'm using it as a relatively neutral term, C, which appears in an awful lot of old Romance texts. So we see it in the Strasbourg Odes, which under certain accounts is the first written attestation of Romance, although that's sort of in scare quotes that we have. And we see it in various texts from a variety of Romance varieties right up until the 15th century. But it's something that generally has been very, very problematic to analyse. And what I suppose I'm going to suggest today is, at first blush, talking to you about a particle in some medieval Romance languages maybe sounds like a slightly parochial topic for a talk that isn't actually going to be very interesting. I hope to show that actually it's intimately connected to a lot of other areas of early Romance morphosyntax, and can tell us some things not only about the earlier stages of different Romance vernaculars, but the shape of variation we see within Romance-speaking Europe today. So as a bit of background, as lots of you will know, there are lots of wide-ranging, data-rich studies of the medieval Romance languages which have emerged particularly in the last 3 decades. But it's worth saying this is not actually a new phenomenon, and people since, well, in the 1870s and well before have been noting that there are massive differences between the medieval Romance languages and their modern counterparts. But that said, despite this very, very long tradition of scholarly literature on early Romance, there are a number of puzzles remaining. So one is, I think, a very positive development within the field, and particularly in the last 20 years, has been the emergence of studies of so-called syntactic or morphosyntactic microvariation within Romance. That's the idea that we're not just talking about large-scale differences that maybe differentiate Portuguese from Spanish, and Spanish from Catalan, and Catalan from Occitan, Occitan from French, but actually we're able to talk about far more fine-grained distinctions which differentiate different regional varieties. And there's an interesting question which remains that says, okay, if we identify there's that much variation in Romance-speaking Europe today, and we know that a lot of the factors and the sociolinguistic factors conditioning lots of linguistic variation were maybe even stronger 500 or 600 years ago, then can we draw up maps of microvariation of that type going back, say, 1,000 years? A second question, which is maybe slightly easier to answer, but in some senses, particularly with reference to morphosyntax, has not been looked at so much, is the extent to which we can talk about grammatical changes within the medieval period. So that's saying, and I'm taking no strong stand here on what the medieval period is, because it's very problematic to try and delineate these things, but looking, say, from the 9th to the 13th, 14th centuries and slightly beyond, is it possible to talk about major changes that happen in particular Romance varieties within that period? And the third point, which kind of relates to the previous two, is the extent to which we can talk about relationships between changes. So that's to say, we know that the system of null arguments, that's to say whether you can have a null subject, a null object, some kind of null topic in early Romance, is very, very different to the modern languages. Likewise, various people have claimed that the medieval Romance languages, or at least some of them, were verb-second languages, whereas that's not the standard analysis for most Romance languages spoken today, with the notable exception of the Rheto-Romance varieties. And likewise, we know that the mapping between syntax and pragmatics is quite distinct in early texts. If you present a standard modern French speaker, if such a thing exists, with a 10th century text and you just translated it into modern French but without changing the word order, quite a lot of the judgments you get are, okay, well, it's stuff to do with syntax, pragmatics, emphasis, whether something is interpreted as thematic or focal, which are major differences between earlier stages of the language and the languages it's spoken today. So the focus of this paper, as I said, is a discussion of an area of medieval Romance syntax which I think you can fairly call ubiquitous. And as I suggested earlier, I'm going to suggest it intersects a number of core changes in clausal syntax. And the main thrust of the argument today is going to say, well, kind of two big things. One is that there is a real interconnectedness of change affecting C, which has not always previously been noted in the literature. Secondly, that C may actually have effects on other areas of the syntax, which again is not something that's been looked at so much. And thirdly, that you can actually talk about distinct stages for diachronic, maybe more tentatively, but distinct diachronic stages of the progression of C. So that's to say what we see in a particular century may be quite distinct to what we see in a different one. So I'm going to start with some empirical background on Old French, and precisely in this vein of saying, okay, a lot of these changes are related, I'm giving a reasonable amount of background here. So starting with contemporary French varieties, it's fairly well known that there is a distributional difference between finite verbs in French and certain types of adverbs, and finite verbs in English and certain types of adverbs. And you've got that distinction in 1 and 2, where if you have a verb like always and you have a French verb like toujours, generally speaking, the finite verb occurs before that adverb in standard French, whereas it occurs after it in English. And since seminal work by Pollock in the end of the 80s, a fairly standard generative analysis of this is that your verb moves to a particular position, in early work I, in later work T, within the clause medial inflectional layer. So the distinction is argued to hold in lots of work that the difference within a generative model of syntax between French and Italian and possibly Spanish on the one hand and say English on the other is that the verb targets a higher position known as T in French, Italian, Spanish, but not English. But this classic account is arguably a simplification of the facts, and there's been a lot of work done, most notably on Italian dialects recently, which has shown actually if you take into account a very large range of adverbs and you look at lots of different factors conditioning the type of verb, and you then start to look at regional variation, there's evidence actually that you have a relatively articulated set of positions within the clausal hierarchy which that finite verb can target, and there is a lot of internal variation, say, within Italy, and even internal variation between different French varieties in that respect. Now, turning over the page now to page 3, this is actually quite an important claim if Old French is a V2 language. So, very classic account of verb second is that your verb second is a bipartite constraint, that you basically have two components which, at least in a fairly simple account, derive the linear ordering aspect where your verb is normally in second position of the clause. The first part of the verb second constraint says you have what's called V to C movement, where your finite verb moves to the same position that normally hosts the complementizer. And this correctly predicts in a number of verb second languages the fact you don't get verb second effects in most embedded clauses. You then have a second part of the verb second constraint which fronts some pragmatically salient constituent to the position immediately before that, in formal terms spec CP. But there's actually a bit of a puzzle here, because if V to T movement is actually a cover term for a range of verb movement operations targeting positions within the inflectional layer of the clause, then maybe we should question again what V to C movement is, because if, like 3, you adopt a relatively articulated approach to the left periphery of the clause, you've got lots and lots of different positions there, all of which a priori can host the finite verb and this moved constituent. And this has led lots of different approaches in the literature to the verb second phenomenon. So Christine Salverson, working on Old French, has said, okay, Old French is a language that has what she calls V to fin movement. The idea being, if you have this very articulated left peripheral space, that your verb moves to the very lowest position within that articulated space. There have been various people who have adopted what you can call the V to focus account of verb second. This entails that you move your verb a tiny bit higher if you look at that schema in 3, so just above fin to the focus layer. And this is something I had take a bit of issue with, but it's not really the focus of this talk. Implied in this account is that the first constituent in these verb second stages of these languages is a focus. And then a slightly more recent stance that's been adopted by myself, but actually drawing on insights by Alain Rougeret in a 2004 paper, is that at least some stages of medieval Romance have very, very high verb movement, all the way to force, which under most cartographic approaches to left periphery is a very, very high position. Now, if this all seems a bit abstract, in slightly more practical terms, this means if you take a basic verb second clause, which I've given you there from the Chanson de Roland in 4, where we have masse and matins, messe et matins, and then you've got your finite auxiliary ad, and then l'igresse, the king, in post-verbal position, means it can be derived, at the very least, under these accounts, 3 different ways, which you've got schematized in 5. So that's just something to keep in mind, which I'm going to come back to later in the talk. But the core intuition is this idea that if you have this articulated left peripheral space, that there may be different types of verb second languages where your verb moves to a different position within the clause. Looking at another difference between early French varieties and contemporary French, modern French licenses a variety of so-called inversion structures where you end up with your subject appearing in post-verbal position. And generally speaking, in these constructions in contemporary French, not all of them, but some of them, non-pronominal post-verbal subjects occur to the right of past participles. So in a subjunctive complement, you've got there in 6, you've got soit éliminer cette solution. So I require that this solution be eliminated, where cette solution occurs after the past participle. This contrasts with Old French, where we also find post-verbal subjects to the left of past participles, infinitives, and manner adverbs. And this has been used as a key piece of evidence that Old French had this very high verb movement to C. And you've got that exemplified in 7. In 8, you also see that you also get what you might call, simplistically, the modern French type of post-verbal subject, where the subject occurs after the past participle. So we have this alternation between post-verbal subjects in pre-past participial position and those that occur after participles and other elements that within formal terms might be seen as demarcating the left edge of the verb phrase. Now turning over to page 5, the descriptive conclusion then is that Old French appears to feature multiple post-verbal subjects positions. And in some recent work, it's been claimed by some people that you have a higher subject position, which is within a clause medial position in the inflectional layer, which seems specialised in hosting definite discourse-active thematic subjects. Whereas generally speaking, it seems like the lower position, that's when you get them after past participles, infinitives, and VP adverbs or manner adverbs, it seems to be an alternation. They can either be discourse old or discourse new. Another difference, there's some controversy about whether standard, what we might call standard modern metropolitan French, to put several qualifiers on, is a null subject language or not. The general consensus now, I'd say, is that it's not a null subject language, and the facts are a little bit more complicated than that. Whereas pretty much everyone agrees that to some extent, Old French was a form of null subject language. And I'm simplifying the facts a little bit here for what we need just for this paper. The system until about 1200, so most texts dating from prior to this show this kind of system. You can get null subjects in main clauses and they can yield verb initial orders like the one you've got in 9. Jeter le à terre, he throws it to the ground. You can also get null subjects in a range of embedded clauses. Most people agree there's a change. Not everyone agrees on when the change is, but it's some point between 1180 and 1220 based on the text we have available. You get heavy restrictions on null subjects in embedded clauses and near total absence of verb initial clauses. Generally speaking, it seems like you cannot have verb first clauses in that period of French. Interestingly, and it's a bit of a puzzle, from about 1350 onwards, you start seeing the change reversed again and you start finding verb initial clauses. So there's a bit of a challenge there. I think the final point, although I haven't turned over the page yet, that I'm going to talk about that's different between modern French and Old French is that Old French has a pre-verbal position which is not specialised for subjects, like other verb second languages. And it's worth saying this is a point of agreement between traditional descriptive work and more formally oriented approach, although people couch it in slightly different terms. So for example, if you have a direct object in initial position, like in 10, you typically get inversion of the verb and subject. Particularly importantly for this talk, you have a range of particles that can occur in the pre-verbal field, and these have accrued a very, very large literature. And it's fair to say, summarising a huge amount of work, that they probably elude satisfying translation. They're a big problem if you ever spend time trying to translate from early French texts. Descriptive work is very contradictory on these particles and their distribution. And there are lots of different formal analyses about which I'm afraid you're about to hear a lot more. So this it was quite interesting actually. This was something that I sort of felt that I needed to look at a little bit, and I thought, oh, I'll look at this over a weekend, and then ended up spending about 6 months working on it. The corpus I'm using for the talk today, although I have looked at some other texts which I can talk about in question period, is the one set out in table 1. Which is a selection of 7 texts taken from both the 12th and 13th centuries. And these are philologically reliable texts as far as we know from the Bases de Français médiéval. From some of these texts I extracted all the C clauses, and from others which were slightly longer I took out 300. And these were all annotated for a dozen syntactic and discourse pragmatic variables. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about previous approaches to C, and you'll see why that's relevant, because kind of giving the game away a bit, I kind of end up saying that although they're quite contradictory, in some ways they're all right. So one approach to C says, okay, C is just an adverb. You could kind of summarize this as it's an adverb stupid. It's kind of saying, okay, that's the end of the story, and it's just like lots of others. This appears in a lot of descriptive work. And at first glance, there's quite a lot to be said for this classification. So first, C derives from a Latin temporal deictic adverb, sic, which we find in a lot of later post-classical Latin texts, which in turn derives from a manner adverb, meaning thus, like this. So and you've got some examples, you've got one example from Latin there in 11. Another piece of evidence that maybe says, okay, this adverbial analysis might be along the right grounds is that C triggers inversion of the verb and subject, just like other adverbials. But there's a number of unanswered questions with this account. One is the sheer abundance of C. Foulet, writing in 1928, says in early French, there's hardly a page where it doesn't appear several times. And there are various other people who've reached similar conclusions. Just looking at 2 texts in the corpus I'm using today, it occurs every 20 lines in the Roland, and the lines are quite short, and it occurs every 24 lines in Charette. There's also a possible issue, which is that this analysis may be a bit of a weak fit for situations where you end up with an initial clause, such as a WH clause, an adverbial clause, or a temporal adverb occurring with C. Now, these increased quite markedly in the 13th century, and although a priori you might say, well, okay, just one example with some kind of clause before, I can see how maybe you'd need an adverb saying so, thus, something like that there. It's a bit puzzling, for example, why in La Caisse you end up with a C occurring after an initial clause 177 times in a relatively short passage of text. It's near systematic, and this is something that other people, it's a very kind of impressionistic observation, but various other people I know work on Old French said, oh yeah, but it just happens all the time after a clause, doesn't it? Now turning over the page, and this is possibly the biggest problem of all, and this is pointed out most compellingly by Suzanne Fleischmann in a very significant 1991 article. C co-occurs with adverbs that encode exactly the same notions of temporal continuity and succession that C itself is meant to encode. So you've got adverb donc, thus, there, other adverbials like puis, then. And it seems a bit puzzling. This is a point that Fleischmann makes in that early article, saying, well, actually, if C itself is meant to mean so, thus, it occurs rather too many times with other adverbs that are meant to mean exactly the same thing for that analysis to be along the right grounds. Now, another analysis, which I think really came to particular prominence in work by Suzanne Fleischmann in the early 90s and late 80s, is C as a marker of continuity of topic, or a point she makes very explicit in a 1992 chapter, same subject reference. And again, actually, this has quite a long pedigree, and slightly similar points are actually made in an 1880 descriptive grammar of Old French. Now, this accounts for a lot of the data. If we look at example 15, you have le vassal, the vassal, and then what you have, if you go through, I won't read out the whole example, but you've got basically C seemingly resuming this understood thematic subject at various other points. And likewise, in various other contexts, you have cases where C seems to be serving a disambiguating function, saying, okay, this is the same subject, not the other, say, object or something else that we've encountered previously in a discourse. Another piece of evidence which fits quite nicely with this account is that C, there's an absence of C at what Fleischmann terms thematic paragraphs. Basically, fairly logical portions of text never seem to begin with C. But the analysis itself is not entirely without problems. Perhaps these two objections I'm going to raise seem almost contradictory, but I think both in their own way kind of make us think about it again. One is that you actually get rather a lot of C co-occurring with subjects which are arguably active or accessible in the discourse in the terms of Lambrecht. And this is not exceptional at all. And I'm going to give you some statistics on this later on. So for example, in example 16, you have c'est de ville, this town, and then you have CE, where quite obviously this town is the subject of that sentence. I think not irrelevant here is the fact that French at this stage is a form of null subject language. So a priori, it should be absolutely fine with not having an explicit preverbal subject. But it's got one there, and it's also got C co-occurring with it. Problematic maybe in a slightly different way are examples like 17, where you've got a case there, so s'il furent, et Gérard. So Gérard and Gérard were there. Where straightforwardly in that the portion of text you've got there, they are brand new. They are not inferable from any other portion of text. They're providing information which is presumably new to both to the reader/hearer. But yet we still get them co-occurring with C, which if it's an explicit marker of same subject reference, seems slightly problematic. Fleischmann does actually say, well, there are a few examples of this type, but I'm going to go on to show that at least in some texts, you can't really dismiss them as a few. Probably the most popular analysis at the moment, if you can kind of turn this into a beauty contest, is analysis along the following lines, which says C is a form of last resort mechanism to satisfy some part of the verb second constraint. So some people have said C is a phrasal category, so the idea being that instead of fronting a constituent, as you normally would in a V2 language, you just stick C in the preverbal position. Some other people have said C is a head, so it stands in instead of the verb. So you front some constituent and then you don't move your verb up to a high position within the clause. And Adam Ledger in a 2008 article says, okay, it's an alternative strategy to fronting your verb. Ferraresi and Goldbach in the 2002 chapter say it's a complementary strategy. One of the reasons I'm not going for this head analysis here is we saw earlier on that one of the hallmarks of Old French syntax is the fact that when you front a phrasal constituent, you get so-called Germanic inversion, where your subject occurs between an auxiliary and a past participle. We actually get this with C, which suggests very strongly that there is verb fronting going on there, and you've got that example in 18. But at the same time, this idea it's linked to verb second has certain advantages. So one is, although one might take issue with the idea that expletives don't actually have semantic properties, lots of people say, okay, there is a sort of semantically vacuous nature to C. And you could say, okay, some sort of expletive analysis fits quite nicely with that. Secondly, C is near completely absent in embedded contexts, and we know that embedded contexts are also where you generally don't find verb second in Old French, although it's a bit of a simplification. And likewise, although it's a bit of a fallacy to, as a historical linguist, to say, okay, the fact that these two things happen at the same time means one causes the other, it does fit with the observation that C declines at exactly the same time as verb second does in the history of French. But likewise, there are still some questions. One is, what exactly is last resort? The second one is, how do we reconcile this analysis with the clear discourse pragmatic effects that C has in certain texts? So that's previous approaches and what might be good in them and what might be problematic. I'm now going to go on to the kind of meat of the talk, which is the new stuff. So I apologise for the blank space here, but I wanted to give you a decent size table because it's quite important. Table 1, if you turn over onto page 13, outlines and summarises the main findings of the corpus analysis, which I'm going to go through now. Okay, so the first point I'm going to talk about is clauses which either begin with C, where the verb is in second position, or cases where you have an initial clause followed by C. All texts in this corpus show orders where C is the only preverbal constituent, so you get C plus verb. Secondly, when C is the only preverbal constituent, it can co-occur with a subject which is either discourse old or new in postverbal position. Thirdly, every text I looked at has C occurring after an initial clause, although there is actually quite a lot of variation between texts in this regard. And you've got examples of that in 20 and 21. But one of the most striking findings from the corpus is the fact that pretty much at the same time, you see a decline in the relative frequency of the C initial pattern and a rise in the clause plus C configuration. And you have that if you turn over the page onto page 15, shown in figure 1, where I've just given you percentages there because you've got the raw data in table 1. Now, this clearly warrants some discussion, because in the paradigm case, C is often described as being a competing strategy to the use of an overt or a null subject in Old French. Now, we might actually expect the exact opposite to obtain. We might expect C initial clauses to massively rise during this period, on the grounds that this is exactly the point at which null subjects in initial position start declining. So you actually, on functional ground, you might say, okay, well, if you have this placeholder, which can be the first constituent of verb's second clause, you might expect that to skyrocket at the same point where the option of having a null subject in initial position declines. Likewise, this rise in clause initial configurations doesn't follow naturally from any of the previous accounts of C that have been outlined in the literature. Second thing we should look at is C and the syntax of subjects. So both Fleischmann and Marcello Nizia, which are in certain ways the most detailed studies of C that have been done until now, or at least up until kind of, the last few years, show there's a gradual increase in the proportion of C clauses which feature an overt postverbal subject. And you see this in figure 2, although the diachronic progression isn't entirely neat. In terms of discourse status, if we look at Roland, Thebe, and Charette, you get a tendency for postverbal subjects to be informationally new. Whilst if you look at Clary and Lequestre, generally they show more numerous subjects which are discourse old. And you can see those changes summarised in table 2. Now turning over now to page 17, preverbal subjects also show some variation. So if we look, although numbers are relatively small here, if we look at Roland, Aeneas, Clary, and Kest, we find that subject plus C clauses account for between 1 and 1.6% of all attestations of C. This climbs, I would say, to a not completely insignificant amount, but again, fairly small numbers, in the text we might view as slightly later, although again, it doesn't neatly map onto diachrony, where we find between 4 and nearly 8% of clauses showing preverbal over preverbal subjects. And I'm going to come on to this, it's perhaps not unrelated that in the texts where we show most preverbal subjects, we also find the strongest tendency for postverbal subjects to encode new information. Third property, you get configurations where you have a prepositional phrase co-occurring with C. And there are various functions that these prepositional phrases perform. If you get them in a sort of adverbial or a locative function, such as 22 and 23, these are more uniformly attested than when you have a prepositional phrase which is an indirect object, which are only found in 3 of the earlier 12th century texts. Fourth property, looking at adverbial and C configurations, every text except Lequestre, which is the very latest text, shows adverbs co-occurring with C. But in the Roland, these are VP level manner adverbs. Whereas in all other texts, they're what we might call frame-setting adverbials, things like then, afterwards, so. And you've got an example there in 25a we have durement en alt, so loudly or strongly on high is the literal translation, he proclaims his sins. He's been very naughty. 25b, concurrentement, so conqueringly. Not very nice idiomatic translation, but it's saying that he's ending his life as a conquering hero. And contrast that with 26. Fifth property, we also get C to a very small extent co-occurring with direct objects, and Marcello Nizia already says in the 1985 book on C that these are relatively rare, which is confirmed if you look at table 1. But they are found in several texts. So we have this example from de Roland in 27a, Res Vivien, si sur Ras en Imph, so help King Vivian there in Imph. What's quite interesting, and I'll come on to talk about more, is the fact that the Roland, which is our very earliest text, is the only text containing an informationally new direct object, whereas in all the other texts, they're discourse old. They've mentioned in the previous portion of text. And this is important because it may well be that this example we've got there in 27a is the only instance of a preverbal informationally focused object occurring with C, i.e. one that unambiguously encodes new information. Now, sixth property are cases where C is the third constituent in the clause. These are never numerous, so even looking at 300 or so instances of C in each text, sometimes a little bit more, you only get between 1 and 17 attestations. But they are worth talking about a little bit because verb third and verb fourth clauses have become a very controversial topic within historical Romance linguistics, and I've given you some references there in footnote 7. Now, you could maybe talk about a small-scale decline for verb third if you look at figure 3. But it's not completely neat, as you can see, looking across texts. And actually, Villaduen shows the highest amount of verb third in the whole corpus, and it is one of the later texts. However, what's interesting is it is attested to a very small extent in La Caisse. You literally have one occurrence of verb third, and that may be a significant point, because La Caisse is a text which has often been held up in studies of Old French syntax as showing lots of, again, scare quotes, innovative properties. Okay, so what do we make of all of this? And the data aren't completely neat. I kind of start with that caveat. Lots of accounts have viewed C as a relatively homogeneous entity. If you pick up most primers, say, that are sort of descriptively oriented on Old French syntax, and there'll be a couple of pages on C, and it'll say C does this. And likewise, some more recent treatments have kind of painted a similar picture. But the account actually needs to account for the following variation. So one is there's these topic continuity contexts, which definitely are there. But there are other cases where this clearly doesn't look like a very plausible interpretation of the data. Secondly, there seems to be this link with the verb second property, which is characteristic of all these texts under discussion. Thirdly, we get this, and I think that's one of the clearer things coming out of the corpus, this fall in C initial clauses and rise in clause plus C configurations overall. Fourth, we have this tendency in 13th century texts for post-verbal subjects to only be discourse old. Fifth, we seem to see a decline in focused elements before C. That's to say, VP-level adverbs, new information direct objects, new information indirect objects. And sixth, and I'm almost a bit kind of wary about using the word decline here because the numbers are so small, but it seems to be the case that in the later texts, orders where the verb or C is third or fourth seem to be less frequent than in some of the earlier ones, but with a bit of a caveat there. Okay, so what do we make of this? Well, I'd like to claim that in the Chanson de Roland, this is really the paradigm case where the topic continuity analysis looks most appropriate. And this is the analysis that is put forward in a lot of detail and I would say kind of very, very carefully argued by Suzanne Fleischmann in a 1991 article, but it's also something that various people have opted for before. Some people in the room will be familiar with Scurup's 1975 enormous work on Old French. He opts for this kind of analysis of C. And likewise, there's work that's been done by Peter van Reenen and Lena Schössler right throughout the 1990s, right up to I think the final chapter of this sort of, I was about to use a term from the Alien films, quadrilogy, appears in 2000, opting for this idea that you have this topic continuity analysis. So it seems to fit with Le Chanson de Roland. Firstly, the majority of attestations of C in Le Chanson de Roland are cases where C is the only preverbal constituent. And this kind of fits with the idea that in a verb second language, the first constituent is frequently a default topic. That's a very common claim in the verb second literature, but also the literature in Old French. Secondly, the low proportion of over preverbal, and still there but not so high, postverbal subjects is expected under this account. If C's function in the text is to encode continuity of topic, and more explicitly in Fleischmann's work she says same subject reference, you don't really expect it to be co-occurring with an overt subject as well. Turning over now to 21, but we still have this slightly problematic case, and there is this case in the Roland where we have an initial WH clause followed by C. And this doesn't straightforwardly follow from a topic continuity analysis. Now, my proposal as to how we capture this is the following, which is that in various works, people have said, okay, sic, in post-classical Latin texts has a function quite often of encoding temporal continuity. And what we've seen in a transition from Latin to Romance is one perhaps relatively small scale reanalysis where C no longer just indicates temporal succession, but basically continuity of theme, of topic. So like other adverbials, it can optionally satisfy the verb second constraint by raising it into left periphery. That's something that almost all descriptive accounts of French, which say, okay, it has a verb second grammar, and more formally oriented accounts have converged upon, is saying, okay, adverbs can satisfy verb second, just as they can in a language like German, Danish, or Norwegian. But it may well be that in contexts where there is an initial clause in Old French, and this is something which has been raised quite prominently in the work by someone called Brian Donaldson, who was until quite recently, I think, at the University of Indiana, it may well be that these clauses don't count for verb second. Now, I'm not going to sort of get particularly or focus too much on theoretical detail in this talk, but the interesting thing is, if you say that C has at least originally this temporal deictic function, one of the interesting things, if you look at the clausal hierarchy in 30, is it's relatively high within the inflectional layer. Now, I'm not going to bore you all with accounts of relativized minimality, but there is this long tradition within the minimalist literature of saying, okay, if you have something that wants something lower in the clause to move, all other things being equal, you will move the highest thing within the clausal hierarchy. In sort of post-2000 terminology, that's the nearest goal in a probe-goal-agree relationship. So it may well be that temporal deictic adverbials kind of have something inherent to them, i.e. they're very, very high in the inflectional layer of the clause, which makes them kind of perfect candidates, things to satisfy verb second when nothing else can. So it may well be that in cases where you have an initial clause, which may be relatively high in the clausal layer, perhaps so high it can't count for verb second, that what you end up doing is moving C as a kind of almost as an accidental expletive. It's not saying it has a fully grammaticalized expletive function at this point, but it's the nearest thing in the clause to satisfy the verb second constraint when something else can't. Now, if you adopt an articulated approach to the left periphery, which lots of people have assumed for early Old French in particular, so that's particularly 11th and 12th century texts, where does C move in the left periphery? Well, you might say, and it would be kind of fairly straightforward to say this, well, it would be a position within the topic layer because C indicates continuity of topic. But one of the problems is we have cases, and have I given you an example here? No. We have cases they're not very numerous, but we do have a case in the Roland where C co-occurs with another preverbal subject, which looks discourse old. So it seems like it can't be targeting the same position as this subject. Likewise, C can be preceded by focal elements. So it seems again that you can't say that C is occupying a position within the focus layer. So I conclude that C at this point is a phrasal category which must be in spec fin P, so specify a position very low in the left periphery where it can be preceded by elements in the thematic and focus layer. And this fits with a number of recent accounts of early Old French verb second that say it has V to fin movement and you move some kind of phrasal constituent to this position. Now, in the 12th century, I think it's where we probably see the most variation between texts. You identify this rise in configurations where C is preceded by an initial clause. So these jump from a mere 4% in the Roland to around 20% in a number of the 12th century texts. So you could say, okay, if we're already seeing evidence in the Roland for C having this last resort function where it seems to be satisfying verb second, we might develop the following hypothesis. We might say, okay, in 12th century, C is first merged, so that's directly inserted into the clausal spine, not moved, in spec thin P, when no other constituent can satisfy verb second via movement. And there is some evidence for this. So subject plus C clauses increase in frequency across all three texts, though most notably in Charette. Secondly, all these subjects are tagged in the corpus as discourse old. They are generally thematic subjects. And within the cartography literature, there's this quite common assumption that at least certain types of topics are base generated. That's basically saying they're directly inserted into left periphery. They don't reach it via movement. So if this is the case and you've got something which is being directly inserted into left periphery, verb second's still not happy because you haven't got something moving to satisfy verb second. The third piece of evidence for this is that C can occur with adverbials in the 12th century, but all of them are frame-setting or speaker-oriented adverbials. And again, lots of the more formal work on this recently has said that these are directly inserted, base-generated, very high in the left periphery. So again, they are not moving to satisfy verb second. And in fact, it's in these texts that we see quite a clear syntax-pragmatics mapping emerging. Pre-verbal subjects with C are consistently discourse old, whereas new information subjects seem only to occur in post-verbal position. And I've schematized that in Roman numeral 7. Why might this be? Well, it seems to be that there is a growing incompatibility between foci and C. So we find no focused direct objects in texts other than the Roland. Although we do find a focused indirect object PP in Charette and Aeneas. We find no manner or VP level adverbs in texts other than the Roland. And given that most people agree French loses this ability to license so-called pre-verbal information focus, this is a constituent that is brand new information before the verb, around 1200, we could potentially speculate that C contributes to the decline of information focus. Basically, if C is starting to take on this function where you can think of it as a kind of bottleneck in the left periphery, it is blocking movement of anything to a higher position, that's a bit of a problem because most people working on the syntax of focus within minimalism and cartography assume that focal elements always move to the left periphery. So if you've got this element that is a priori incompatible with movement, this type of focus is a little bit doomed. So to summarise, lots of variation between texts, but there's progressive attestation of a grammar where C loses its unambiguous topic continuity role and increasingly acts as a last resort mechanism to satisfy verb second. And it's just worth saying, I was about to say as an aside, but it's not really an aside, this follows a typical grammaticalisation path, particularly following work by Robertson Rousseau, but also more recent work by Elie van Gelderen, where a constituent originally moved to a higher functional position comes to be base generated there. Now, final set of texts, the 13th century French texts. So Villarduin is a bit of an outlier. It actually fits with 12th century texts more than the 13th century ones. So the same analysis seems to be more or less correct. You don't get VP adverbs or indirect objects focused before C. You see the increase in clause plus C configurations, and you see the increase in overt post-verbal subjects. But it also has the highest proportion of subject plus C configurations we find in the whole corpus. So there's 32 of them, that's around 8%. And it shows these C third orders where you end up with a frame setting expression, so in this case in that time, co-occurring with a thematic expression. But Clary and Lequestre show some slightly different characteristics. Now, they seem to show major changes in their syntax. And I'd like to suggest this suggests that the expletive has been reanalyzed even further upwards within the left periphery. And this is in line with the force V2 hypothesis that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk, the idea that in certain later Old French texts you have a grammar where the verb moves to a very, very high position within the clausal hierarchy. And there are a couple of points which point to this idea that there has been this diachronic change. One is there's only one instance of the C third order in Lequestre and two in Clary. And generally people acknowledge in 13th century French prose you don't get very much verb third. And that follows naturally if you assume that your verb is moving so high that there is hardly any left peripheral space to the left of it. It also accounts for the massive rise you get in clause plus C configurations. These are nearly 60% of occurrences of C in Laqueste and 40% in Clary. Now, a lot of recent work has said, okay, well, WH clauses, adverbial clauses, circumstantial clauses, these are typical frame setters, which in a cartographic approach, which I realise not everyone adopts, occur within the frame layer, which is basically the only position you have to the left of force within an articulated model of left periphery, the type you've got in 8. So that again follows onto the account. And likewise, we don't expect to find indirect or direct objects occurring before C because they have a natural home lower down in the left periphery. So the big picture is seemingly this. And it's worth keeping in mind here, I'm sort of trying to schematise and say, okay, what's similar and what's going on overall, but there's noise in the data here, as we would expect there to be, and it's not all completely neat. So you seem to see evidence of a VP manner adverbial stage in classical Latin. Various people looking at later post-classical texts say, well, C then seems to have, sic seems to have a temporal deictic adverbial function, generally serves to move the narrative ahead. In the Roland, the topic continuity analysis seems to be the most fitting one. And I've suggested that you see a difference between 12th century verse and 13th century prose, in that both seem to see C seems to have this expletive-like function in satisfying verb second, but the exact position it targets within an articulated left periphery seems to be distinct between the two periods. And I've got that mapped out with bracketing on figure 4. Now, it's worth saying this is potentially one of many cases of grammaticalization in the passage from Latin to Romance. So if we take a manner adverbial to be at least semi-lexical, it's clear that an expletive is a functional element. So we've seen this shift from lexical to functional. I gave you references earlier on the handout about people who say C is somehow semantically vacuous. So it seems to be a classic case of it being bleached of its pragmatico-semantic content. Various scholars of grammaticalization have highlighted this issue of a widening of distribution, which Lehmann, in a recent edition of his book on grammaticalization, calls the defining factor of grammaticalization. And it also seems to be a very straightforward case of upwards reanalysis in the terms of Robertson-Rousseau and Van Gelderen. And we can schematize these reanalyses as follows. You go from a manner adverb to a temporal adverb to a topic continuity adverb, and then an expletive which is merged low in the left periphery to one which is merged very high. So to summarise and conclude, at first sight, C seems to be a fairly boring parochial topic with relatively little external significance. But if I haven't convinced you of everything today, I at least hope to have convinced you a little bit that that's maybe not the case. Empirically, it contributes to the growing view that Old French was subject to extensive internal variation in its morphosyntax, aside from phonology and pure morphology, where this is generally acknowledged and has a much longer tradition of people making this observation. Theoretically, C is an engaging case of upwards grammaticalization, and it may be unusual, actually, in providing a genuine case where a constituent seems to have been successfully reanalyzed almost along the entire length of the clausal spine, from a very, very low position to basically the highest position you can get at the very end of its history. A thorny issue remaining in the historical syntax literature is how you capture the relatedness of certain clusters of change. And one approach which had advantages, but almost everyone would agree disadvantages, is found in a lot of the early work by David Lightfoot on so-called catastrophic change. C is kind of pertinent here as it changes its syntax, but its changes are contingent upon other changes going on in Old French syntax at this point. And it seems to also have an effect on other areas of Old French syntax. Now, the final thing is everyone acknowledges there are fundamental morphosyntactic splits between Gallo-Romance on the one hand, and in particular Southern Italo-Romance. And one of these areas is the ease with which constituents are moved into left periphery. Put very simplistically, in lots of Southern Italian dialects, Sardinian and Sicilian, it is much easier to front certain things than it is in, say, standard French. Now, given C's ubiquity in Old French texts and growing incompatibility with other moved elements in the left periphery, we may have one of probably many answers as to why. because it basically grows, it's very, very common, and it seems to be completely incompatible with fronting elements via movement. So if this hypothesis is correct, you would predict that old southern Italo-Romance C should not show the same properties as 13th century French C, and that seems to be correct. So if you look at, do corpus analysis, say, on Old Sicilian, which is something I did do, but I cut out of this talk, so I finished on time, you get these contexts where you have an initial focus, you get an initial subject, which massively decline in the history of French, but are still there in 14th and 15th century Sicilian prose. Okay, I think, yes, that is all I wanted to say today. Thank you so much.